Chanty stared into Alexander's eyes, her gaze burning with fury and anguish over Jake's loss. The final look Jake had given her replayed in her mind over and over, like a haunting echo she couldn't silence. Alexander, however, only smirked as he watched her. He found pleasure in the way her fierce eyes glared at him with defiance. It thrilled him, igniting a challenge within him. How would he tame this woman standing before him? The very thought sent a rush of excitement through his veins. His desire to claim her growing stronger with each passing moment. "My queen. I know you must be hungry. I have prepared a grand feast in my palace for the two of us," Alexander said, his voice dripping with persuasion. He was trying to keep the shadow of the sword from fully consuming Chanty's body, prolonging their conversation, prolonging his chance to break through to her. But Chanty merely smiled in disdain. "My queen, come with me. Forget what has happened today. Let us face tomorrow together, ruling this world side by side. I will grant you everything you desire, and together, we shall bring justice for your parents' deaths. The very crime committed by your own king," Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of truth, as if every word he spoke was absolute. But Chanty was unmoved. Her anger toward Alexander only deepened. In one swift motion, she shifted her stance, preparing to strike. Alexander, however, remained perfectly calm, watching her every move with an amused glint in his eyes. "Enough talk, Alexander. I want you to pay for Jake's death with your own blood," Chanty shouted, her voice laced with both rage and grief. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the fury that boiled within her. And with that, she lunged at him, her attack swift and deadly. The shadow of the sword fully took control of her now, its power manifesting as her eyes burned a deep crimson, matching Alexander's own gaze. Yet Alexander dodged effortlessly, teleporting away in a blur. Chanty's attacks had no effect on him. Lightning fast, Chanty struck again and again, her speed nearly unmatched. But Alexander, grinning, was enjoying this battle far too much. As their fight raged on, Alexander suddenly unsheathed his crystal sword, blocking Chanty's strike and pushing her back with a forceful parry. Chanty was thrown far into the distance, but she quickly regained balance, landing with fierce determination. She wasted no time, charging at him once more. Alexander had no chance to rest. The shadow of the sword's relentless assault kept him on the defensive. Then, swift as a viper, Chanty's blade sliced across Alexander Mondragon's thigh. A sharp grimace crossed his face as pain shot through him. The serrated edge of the sword of destiny had cut deep, leaving behind a wound that pulsed with burning venom. The poison spread rapidly through his body, seeping into his very bones. Yet, despite the torment, Alexander continued to defend himself, parrying Chanty's strikes one after another. But Chanty, watching his suffering, only seemed to grow more exhilarated. Still, Alexander's movements remained sharp. He was as fast, as fluid, as deadly as ever. And then, in an instant, he was behind her. Before she could react, his arms wrapped around her from behind, locking her wrists in an unbreakable grip. Chanty struggled, twisting and thrashing, but Alexander's strength, despite his bleeding wound, was unyielding. With a dark chuckle rumbling in his chest, he leaned in, inhaling the scent of her skin, his lips hovering just over her neck. The temptation to sink his teeth into her flesh was overwhelming. But it was not yet time. He needed to wait for his full power to return. Once the inner sun shifted back to its original position, Velantis would once again be cast in twilight, a world of eternal dusk. And when that moment arrived, his strength would be fully restored, greater than ever before. And then he would finally claim the immortality that flowed within Chanty's veins. Just a little more patience. Just a few more hours. Chanty thrashed harder against his hold, but Alexander's body was like stone, unyielding, immovable. With practiced ease, he secured a suspended bracelet around her wrist, binding her power. One of his hands remained locked around her wrists, while the other pressed firmly against her trembling fingers. Then, suddenly, he lifted her bound arms above her head. and with a swift teleportation, they were gone. Chanty barely had time to process what had happened before she felt rough bark pressing against her back. Alexander moved too fast. Too fast for Chanty to react. Too fast for her to see. One moment, she was preparing to strike. The next, she was pinned. Her back pressed against the rough bark of a tree. Her arms raised above her head. Her wrists bound. Glowing restraints pulsed around her skin, binding her tightly against the tree. She struggled. Useless. The restraints wouldn't budge. She didn't know what they were. Magic? Energy? Something else? Whatever it was powerful. And then she realized something. The shadow of the sword. It was gone. Now, it was only her. No divine power. No ancient force. Just Chanty. And in front of her, Alexander. Grinning. His face twisted in a smirk, but there was something else. Pain. She saw it. He tried to mask it, but it was there. His right thigh. Wounded. His dark pants were torn, revealing a deep, gaping gash. It bled freely, the wound jagged and raw. Chanty's eyes burned with hatred as she stared at him. She wanted him to suffer. To feel every ounce of pain he inflicted on Jake. And then, Jake. The memory hit her like a dagger to the chest. Jake's last breath. His body. Cold in her arms. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And then, rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. You will pay for what you did to Jake, Alexander. Her voice was a roar. Her body shook as she screamed, veins straining against her skin. You will suffer. But Alexander. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he smiled. And not just any smile. A wicked, hungry grin. His eyes gleamed. Not with anger, but excitement. And then, he was there. So fast. Too fast. Suddenly, he was inches from her. Their bodies nearly touching. Chanty barely had time to gasp before. His face dipped. To her neck. He inhaled deeply, his breath warm against her skin. Chanty froze. Her pulse hammered. A shiver of disgust crawled down her spine. But Alexander. He sighed, satisfied. Your bravery, my queen. His voice was low, sultry, taunting. It makes you even more. He leaned in, whispering against her skin. Irresistible. His lips curled into a smirk. Mouth watering. His fingers ghosted over her bound wrists. Chanty clenched her jaw, eyes blazing. Hatred. Disgust. But Alexander. He only grinned wider. Alexander's deep, full voice resonated in Chanty's ears as his tongue traced a slow, deliberate path along her neck before pressing a kiss against her skin. A violent shudder coursed through Chanty's body. Every hair on her skin stood on end, a visceral reaction to the unwanted contact. She struggled, but Alexander's hold was inescapable, his body caging her completely, trapping her in his overpowering strength. You shameless bastard! Get away from me! Chanty screamed, her voice sharp with fury and desperation. But her anger only seemed to amuse Alexander. A low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. Then, without warning, his hands slid downward, fingers reaching for the zipper of her suit. Slowly, he began pulling it down, exposing the soft skin of her chest. Panic surged through Chanty like wildfire. Her breaths came in frantic, shallow gasps as sheer terror gripped her entire being. In that moment, she did the only thing she could. She screamed for the one person who might save her. No. No. Vasper! Help me! Vasper! Chanty's desperate cries echoed through the desert. But Alexander silenced her. His lips crashed against hers, claiming her with a fervent, unrelenting hunger. At the same time, the zipper of her suit continued its descent under his touch. Chanty thrashed against him, but it was useless. And then, her world began to blur. The intoxicating scent of Alexander's breath filled her lungs, seeping into her mind, clouding her senses. It was overpowering, consuming, like a venom that dulled her will to fight. She felt hypnotized, lost. Alexander's mouth moved greedily against hers, his tongue parting her lips, devouring not just her breath but something more, something deeper. He was drinking from her. Her blood. A faint, almost imperceptible pull ran to her veins as Alexander siphoned the blood from her lips. And with each stolen drop, he felt the wound on his thigh begin to close. The torn flesh mended itself, sealing slowly, the pain ebbing away. But even as his body healed, his hunger remained. His lips never left hers, but now, there was something else in his touch. It was no longer just about the blood. There was something deeper. Something raw and possessive. Desire. He wanted more than just her life force. He wanted her. His hands roamed, one slowly traveling upward toward her chest. And then, a sudden flash of movement. Before Alexander's fingers could reach their destination, Vasper Mondragon appeared. And he was not alone. 6 guardians stood beside him, their eyes widening at the scene before them. Shock. Rage. It all happened in a heartbeat. Vasper's grip locked around Alexander's shoulder, and with a single, brutal motion, he hurled his father across the clearing. Alexander crashed into the distance. But before he could even recover, Vasper was upon him. Fists flew. One punch. Another. A relentless assault. Vasper's knuckles collided with Alexander's face, again and again, each blow heavier than the last. The guardians watched in stunned silence. They had never seen anyone ever strike Alexander Mondragon like this. A father and son. So alike in their faces. So different in their hearts. Meanwhile, Jacob moved without hesitation. His hand lifted, and with the power of the black crystal, the suspended bracelet on Chanty's wrist shattered. The magical ropes that bound her to the tree unraveled and fell away. And the moment she was free, Jacob pulled her into his arms. Tightly. Firmly. As if holding her together when she was moments from breaking. Chanty sobbed against his chest, her body trembling violently, her fingers clenching onto him as if he were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Jacob's arms wrapped around her protectively, his warmth shielding her from the cold, from the fear, from everything. His hand reached up, wiping away the steady stream of tears from her cheeks. Then, gently, he pulled the zipper of her suit back up, restoring what had been taken from her. Chanty. Stop crying. We're here now. Vasper brought us here. You're safe with us. Jacob's voice was soothing, his hands never stopping as he wiped away her tears, again and again, as if trying to erase the nightmare she had just endured. But Chanty's gaze shifted, past Jacob, past the guardians. To the distance. To the raging battle in the desert sands. Dust and debris clouded the air as father and son clashed with violent force. And in that moment, panic struck her again. She saw it. Vasper, struggling. He was at a disadvantage. No. Fear surged through her veins once more, her entire body tensing. She couldn't just stand there. She couldn't just watch. The guardians stood in tense silence, watching the battle unfold. David, the most experienced among them, observed with calculating eyes. They all knew the truth. Even weakened. Even now, when his power was at its lowest. Alexander Mondragon was still unstoppable. They had no chance against him. David's eyes locked onto Chanty, his face etched with deep concern. The other guardians mirrored his expression, but none seemed more shaken than Jacob, who still held Chanty protectively in his embrace. Then, as if something had caught his attention, David reached for Shanta's hand. His gaze fell upon the wedding ring adorning her finger, the very ring that belonged to Jake. There were now 2 rings on her hand. But Jake's ring sat loosely on her finger, too large for her. Jake was here? David asked, his voice low as he studied Shanta's face while still holding her hand. Jacob loosened his hold on Chanty, stepping back just enough to see what David had seen. Silence. All eyes turned to Chanty. Then, her shoulders shook. Tears spilled freely down her face as she raised a trembling finger, pointing toward the sand. There. Where Jake had taken his final breath. His blood-stained clothing lay abandoned in the dust. In an instant, the 5 guardians sprinted toward where Chanty had pointed, their bodies moving with desperate urgency. Jacob, however, remained by Shanta's side, his face frozen in shock, unable to process what had happened. Meanwhile, Shanta's wails tore through the desert. Jake, she cried, sobbing uncontrollably. Rage ignited in the guardians' hearts. Fueled by fury, they turned their attention back to the battle. And then, without hesitation, they joined Vasper in fighting Alexander. 6 powerful warriors against 1 monstrous king. Chanty stood frozen, watching the chaos unfold before her eyes. The battle raged in the sand, but the guardians fought with purpose, deliberately drawing Alexander away from where Chanty stood. Then, David's voice cut through the commotion. Jacob! Stay with Chanty. Do not leave her side. Jacob stiffened at the command. But something was happening. The air around Jacob shifted, swirling with energy. Shanta's breath hitched as she turned to look at him. A deep blue aura surrounded his body. His face. It was fierce, hardened with resolve. His eyes locked onto the battlefield, burning with intensity. And then, they saw it. Alexander raised both hands toward the sky. In an instant, the 6 warriors froze in midair. Their bodies, paralyzed, lifted, suspended by Alexander's telekinesis. Chanty and Jacob watched in horror as the 6 men hovered, their faces contorted with effort, resisting the crushing force that held them. This power. It was stronger than anything Lewis had ever wielded. Even Lewis, with all his telekinetic abilities, was powerless now. Panic flooded through Chanty as her gaze darted toward Vasper. His body, bloodied. His clothes, gone, except for his torn pants. His skin, painted red with his own blood. Even from a distance, she could see it. He was struggling. Vasper, she screamed, fear consuming her voice. Jacob didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, his body a streak of blazing blue fire. Shanta's eyes widened in shock. Faster than lightning, Jacob attacked. Blue flames erupted from his hands, hurling toward Alexander in rapid succession. One strike. Then another. And another. Each impact forced Alexander backward. And in that moment, the guardians fell from the sky, freed from Alexander's telekinetic grip. Regaining their footing, they wasted no time. They attacked again. But amid the battle, Vasper's eyes snapped toward Chanty. And his heart stopped. She was running toward them, calling his name. His breath hitched. Danger. Without hesitation, he teleported. In an instant, he was in front of her. And before she could take another step, he pulled her back. With a swift motion, he returned her to the tree where she had been standing. His hands gripped her arms tightly, his bloodied fingers trembling against her skin. Babe. His voice was deep, strained. Please. Stay here. Even as he spoke, his wounds, the cuts, the bruises, began to heal. Shanta's eyes widened as she watched the process unfold before her. His body, covered in blood. The wounds closed. The bruises faded. But even as his injuries healed, his pants remained tattered. His pants barely reached his knees, shredded by the battle. Vasper's hand moved, gently gripping her arm. "I'm so sorry for what Alexander did to you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His blue eyes locked onto hers. Eyes filled with regret. With love. With sorrow. "I promise you, it won't happen again." His voice. It was soft, yet heavy with unspoken pain. Chanty could only stare. Vasper turned back toward the battlefield, his expression darkening. "We'll finish this," he told her firmly. "Stay here." Then, a loud crash. Both Vasper and Chanty turned. Gabriel. His body flew across the field, crashing violently into the ground. Dust and debris exploded into the air. And then, one by one, the guardians followed, thrown aside like dolls. David was the last to fall. Vasper tensed. His jaw clenched. His teeth ground together in barely restrained fury. He was ready to charge. But then, a shadow. A blur. And before he could react, Alexander appeared beside him. With a single, brutal punch, he struck Vasper in the gut. A sickening crunch filled the air. Chanty screamed. Vasper's body crumpled from the impact, folding inward from the sheer force of the blow. Then, Alexander lifted his hand. Vasper's body, pinned, forced against the tree by an invisible force. Alexander's fingers wrapped around his throat, squeezing. A cruel smile played on Alexander's lips. "You traitorous son," he sneered. His grip tightened. "You think I haven't known what you've been doing behind my back, Vasper? I let it slide because I admired your audacity. It showed me you were truly my son, bold, fearless, willing to defy even me." His crimson eyes burned with malice. "But standing against me?" His voice lowered. His grip tightened further. "That I will never forgive." His eyes gleamed. "What, you think you can take my throne?" Alexander chuckled darkly. "You're still too young, my son." He leaned in, voice dripping with amusement. "To become king, you'd need to surpass 1,000 years of power. And as for me," a wicked grin, "I gain another 1,000 every time I devour another soul." His laughter rang through the battlefield. Vasper struggled. But his strength was fading. He could barely breathe. His vision blurred. And then, Chanty moved. She couldn't stand it. Chanty could no longer hold back. The sword of destiny materialized in her hand, gleaming with righteous fury. Without hesitation, she struck. Her blade lunged toward Alexander's body. But faster. Too fast. In the blink of an eye, Alexander vanished. And when he reappeared, he had Vasper. With brutal force, he hurled Vasper's body against a massive boulder. The impact was devastating. A sickening crack echoed across the battlefield as Vasper's body crumpled like a lifeless doll. "Vasper!" Chanty's scream tore through the air. Tears streamed down her face as she sprinted toward him, desperation clawing at her chest. Vasper lay still. Too still. His body, limp and unmoving, looked broken. "Alexander." He laughed. Not just a chuckle. A deep, cruel, mocking laughter. He stood there, watching. Watching Chanty's suffering. Watching his own son's lifeless form. And he was amused. Entertained by their agony. The 6 guardians. They rose. Their bodies, once battered and weak, were now brimming with renewed strength. Alexander sensed them before he turned to face them. And the moment he did, they attacked. A full-force onslaught. Their combined power and speed collided with Alexander in a violent explosion of energy. like thunder and lightning ripping through the scorching desert. Meanwhile, Chanty sobbed as she knelt beside Vasper, her hands trembling as they cradled his broken body. She could feel it. His life force fading. But Vasper wasn't done. Through sheer will, he activated his healing ability. The moment his power surged, Chanty felt it. A faint pulse beneath her fingertips. Stronger. Steadier. Vasper's breathing returned. His wounds began to close. His strength flowed back into him. And then, his eyes snapped open. In one swift motion, he rose. His gaze locked onto Chanty, his expression filled with determination. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Don't worry. We're 7 against him." His voice was steady. Certain. "But Chanty..." She shook her head violently. "No, Vasper." Her voice was raw, filled with rage. "Only I can end his life." Her tears fell freely now. "Only me." Her hands trembled as she clenched the hilt of her sword. "I will avenge Jake's death." Her voice shook, but her resolve did not. "I will avenge my parents." Vasper. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. Chanty's grief. Her fury. It was unbreakable. And for the first time, Vasper realized. This battle was not his to fight. Did he hear that right? Jake dead? A sharp pang twisted in Vasper's chest. Not from fear. Not from shock. But from the undeniable truth. The sword of destiny had not lied. The prophecy had come to pass. Through his mind-reading abilities, Vasper had seen it unfold, Jake's death, a fate already sealed in time. His rival. The only man who had ever stood between him and Chanty's heart. Vasper turned to Chanty, his gaze lingering on her grief-stricken face. Even without words, he could see it, the pain, the unbearable sorrow reflected in her eyes. And it hurt. Because it meant Jake truly mattered to her. Because it meant she had loved him. The chaos of battle raged in the background, but for Vasper and Chanty, time stood still. Tears glistened in Chanty's eyes as she stared at him, unable to speak. For a moment, Vasper remained frozen, unsure how to respond. Then, he moved. Without hesitation, he pulled her into a tight embrace. His heart was torn between two truths, grief and relief. Because no matter how much he mourned for Chanty's pain, a part of him felt freed. He hated himself for it. But he didn't want her to see. So he masked his emotions, burying them beneath the weight of the moment. Vasper pulled away slightly, just enough to look at her. His fingers brushed against her lips, bruised, swollen, wounded by Alexander's merciless bite. A fresh wave of anger surged through him. His father. The monster responsible for all of Chanty's suffering. Vasper's lips pressed into a firm line, his gaze dark with fury. Vasper reached up, placing his hand over hers. "I love you so much," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Tears slipped down Chanty's face, but he didn't wipe them away. He knew. Those tears weren't for him. They were for Jake. But it didn't matter. Jake was gone. Vasper understood that Chanty needed time to grieve, time to heal. And he would give it to her. Leaning in, he kissed her softly. Slow. Lingering. Chanty didn't resist. She didn't respond either. She simply let him hold her, let him kiss her, as if she were too numb to react. But then, it happened. A blur. A force. Alexander. From nowhere, he appeared. With brutal strength, he wrenched Vasper away from Chanty. And through him. The impact sent Vasper hurtling across the desert, crashing into the distant sands with bone-shattering force. Chanty's eyes widened in horror. Shock stole her breath. Before she could even scream, Alexander's arms locked around her. His grip was iron. And in an instant, they vanished. Teleportation. Chanty barely had time to react before they reappeared in a different part of the desert. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. Where was Vasper? Where were the guardians? She couldn't see them. She had been taken. And now, she stood alone with him. Alexander's crimson eyes bore into hers, deadly serious. "You belong to me," he said, his voice deep, unwavering. "No other man will ever have you. Only me. Always." Chanty's body tensed. A sharp, electric surge of defiance rushed through her veins. Without a second thought, she summoned the Sword of Destiny. The moment it materialized in her hand, Alexander stepped back. Not in fear, but in recognition. Then, a shift in the air. A presence. Vasper. He reappeared at Chanty's side, his stance rigid, his gaze locked onto Alexander with pure, lethal intent. And Alexander. He smiled. A slow, knowing smile. For the first time, he saw it. The fire in Vasper's eyes. Not just the fire of battle. The fire of love. And that changed everything. Alexander's smirk widened as he chuckled. "I used to let you meddle in my affairs, son," he mused. "Let you play with my women. Let you take what you wanted." His gaze darkened. "But this one." His eyes flickered toward Chanty. "No. She is mine. You cannot take what already belongs to me." Vasper's blood ran cold. He knew. His father knew. He had always known. And yet, Vasper wasn't surprised. Of course, Alexander had read the minds of the women Vasper had been with. Of course, he had seen it all. But still, hearing him say it aloud, it sent a sharp, twisted rage burning through Vasper's soul. Yet he didn't react. Instead, he smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. A smile laced with mockery. A silent challenge. And Alexander. He recognized it instantly. Danger. But before another word could be spoken, Chanty attacked. And as if drawn by the storm of battle, the guardians arrived. From the farthest reaches of the desert, they came, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. They wasted no time. Jacob moved first. A flurry of fireballs rained down toward Alexander. But missed. Each one dodged effortlessly. And Alexander. He laughed. Jacob's frustration boiled over. And then, a flick of Alexander's wrist. Jacob. Gone. His body was flung across the battlefield, vanishing into the distance. The guardians lunged into action, joining Chanty in her assault. But something was wrong. They couldn't touch him. Not a single hit landed. It was as if his body was made of smoke, slipping through their fingers like a mirage. The legend was true. In a battle against Alexander Mondragon, you could never lay a hand on him. Even in his weakest moments, he remained untouchable. His teleportation. His telekinesis. He was unbeatable. And the fight. It had only just begun. Alexander's laughter thundered through the battlefield. It was a sound of mockery. Of power. Of a predator toying with its prey. One by one, the guardians fell. Their bodies flung into the distance like leaves caught in a storm. But they weren't weak. Not by a long shot. They rose. Fierce. Determined. The battle raged on. And in the heart of it, Chanty, or rather, the shadow of the sword. It had begun to understand. To predict Alexander's movements. Every teleportation. Every flicker of displacement. It was no longer an advantage. The clash of steel against crystal sword filled the air. The guardians and Vasper watched, amazed. Chanty's hands moved too fast for the eye to follow. Her strikes, precise, deadly. And yet, Alexander stood unscathed. Gabriel and Louis exchanged glances, frustration etched into their exhausted faces. No matter what they did, they couldn't touch him. Not even once. David clenched his fists, his body taut with grief and rage. Jake was gone. And they still had to fight. To survive. To avenge. Even Justin and Marco. Their fury burned like wildfire. And Jacob. His fists were wreathed in blue flames. But it didn't matter. Not one of his attacks had landed. Their clothes were shredded. Their bodies caked in sand, sweat, and blood. But Alexander? Aside from the torn cloth on his thigh, he looked immaculate. Powerful. His face, unbothered. A flawless vision of deadly perfection. His ruby-red eyes burned as he smiled. Not with malice, but affection. He only ever looked at Chanty that way. And Vasper Mondragon hated it. Fury burned inside him. A jealous, seething rage. But even he had to admit, they were powerless. Alexander wasn't just an opponent. He was a legend. And legends could only be slain by prophecy. By the sword of destiny. By Chanty. But even she struggled. Alexander's speed. His teleportation. He was untouchable. And then Louis attacked. A battle of telekinesis. The two stood still, locked in a silent war of willpower. Their bodies frozen in place. A crushing, invisible force bound them. Louis's knees began to buckle. His body trembled, forced downward inch by inch. Alexander. He was smirking, mocking, daring him to break. The guardians saw it. And they charged, rushing in before Louis could be forced to kneel. And then Chanty changed. Her eyes, from their usual color, to a luminous blue. Her hair, it floated as if she were submerged in deep water. Alexander felt it. The shift in power. And then she attacked. Lightning fast. Their swords clashed, creating shockwaves in the air. The guardians struck alongside her. Desperate. Unrelenting. But then, pain. One by one, they fell again. David, stabbed in the stomach. Louis and Jacob, slashed across their backs. Marco and Justin, wounded in the thighs. Gabriel, cut in the shoulder. Venom from Alexander's crystal sword burned through their wounds. They gasped, groaned, struggled to focus as they poured all their energy into healing. Vasper watched. His father's mocking stare locked onto him. Alexander raised his hand. A single gesture. A beckoning motion with his fingers. Come. Fight me. His arms spread wide, the crystal sword gleaming in his grasp. His posture. Arrogant. Daring. The guardians writhed in pain. The venom ate at them. And then Chanty struck. Faster than before. Her blade cut. Deep. Across Alexander's left side. Blood spilled. If he hadn't teleported in time, it would have gone through his heart. Vasper's eyes widened. The shadow of the sword was too fast. Too ruthless. Chanty didn't stop. Attack after attack after attack. Until Alexander laughed. He was playing. It was a game of hide and seek. He vanished, only to reappear, again and again. And Chanty? She didn't stop. Vasper's fists clenched. His eyes burned. He watched, silently. Chanty's face, emotionless, expressionless. Only the relentless onslaught of her sword remained. And Alexander met her, blow for blow. Vasper joined the battle. His goal? To slow Alexander down, to stop him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't touch him. And yet, Alexander could touch him. Every strike, every blow, connected. A punch, a kick. Vasper's body hurtled through the air. He crashed. Hard. Pain bloomed in his gut. The wound on his arm from Alexander's crystal sword throbbed, burning with venom. Self-healing could only do so much. That wound would take time. Too much time. Vasper groaned, curling in on himself, struggling to stand. And then he saw them. The guardians. The 6 of them. Gathering. Preparing. Their movements. Precise. Calculated. Chanty. Never once stopping her onslaught against Alexander. And yet, even with her speed, even with her precision, he blocked every single strike. Then, the guardians attacked. Together. Their strategy? Relentless rotation. One after another, they rushed Alexander, forcing him to defend in quick succession. The goal? To slow him down. To create an opening for Chanty. But even alone, even against all of them, Alexander fought. Dominated. The desert wind howled. The air thick with dust and blood. Lightning-fast movements blurred their figures. A storm of gods and warriors. This was a battle of power. A legend against the guardians. Against the bearer of the sword of destiny. Their screams filled the battlefield. And then, Vasper charged. The heir of Alexander Mondragon. The battle raged on. And then, a scream. Marco. His voice ripped through the air. Alexander's sword had pierced his side. His body convulsed from the venom. Justin abandoned the fight, rushing to Marco's side. He tore the remaining fabric from Marco's clothing, pressing it against the wound. Focus. Heal yourself. Justin's voice was steel. Marco's body twitched from the unbearable pain. A pain that dug down to the bone. And then, more screams. Gabriel. Louis. Jacob appeared, carrying them both in his arms. Wounded. Louis took the worst of it. His shoulder and thigh both impaled. Gabriel. A deep gash in his leg. Pain. So much pain. Each of them clenched their jaws, fighting through the agony. The venom. It was like fire inside their veins. Justin's eyes burned as he watched. His voice, low and dangerous. He's immortal. Louis, gripping his bloody leg, his voice shaking with rage. No matter what we do, we can't touch him. Justin's gaze sharpened. Be careful next time. A pause. A deadly warning. Or it'll be your necks. They all looked at each other. A silent vow. No more mistakes. And then, another scream. But this time, Alexander's. Justin bolted upright. No hesitation. No words. He ran. Straight back into battle. And what he saw was glorious. The sword of destiny. buried deep in Alexander's side. The blade had gone through. Straight through his back. Alexander gritted his teeth, retreating. But Chanty did not let go. Did not yield. The blade in her hands sank deeper. Alexander laughed. But this time, it was not laughter of amusement. It was laughter of pain, of struggle, of a man who would not fall. But the sword drank. It consumed his blood, his energy. The once reddish glow of the blade turned blue, bright, hungry, and still. Alexander fought. His telekinesis snared 4 of the warriors behind him. They froze, suspended midair, trapped, struggling, useless. Chanty's eyes blazed. With purpose. With vengeance. And she twisted the blade. Deeper. Sharper. Alexander screamed. Their gazes locked. Her eyes burned. Not with mercy. Not with hesitation. But with one single, undeniable truth. She would end him. Pain. That was all Alexander could feel. The searing agony. The venom coursing through his blood. The wound in his side, torn open by the serrated edge of the sword of destiny. And yet, he fought. His left hand gripped the air, holding the 4 warriors behind him in his telekinetic grasp. His right hand struggled. Desperate. Holding for his own sword. He had to strike. Had to break the sword of destiny. Or he would fall. But Chanty was faster. She yanked her blade from Alexander's side. A fresh, vicious wound spilling hot blood into the sand. And then she struck again. Straight for his left chest. Straight for his heart. But he managed to move and Chanty missed the target. His heart. The scream that tore from Alexander's throat. It was inhuman. The blade's serrated edge ripped through his flesh. And yet, even in pain, even in the face of death, Alexander moved. Vanished. His teleportation power activated in an instant. And with it, David, Vasper, Justin, and Jacob fell from the air, crashing into the sand. Grit. Dust. Blood. They scrambled to their feet. Their bodies tensed. Chanty stood before them. But something was wrong. The energy surrounding the sword of destiny. Once a raging blue. Now, red again. And then, it vanished like smoke from Chanty's hands. Her eyes, once burning bluish, returned to their golden brown. And then, she collapsed. Vasper caught her before she hit the ground. Without a word, he carried her to the shade of a lone tree near a small oasis. She was exhausted. Her breaths shallow, ragged. I feel like I'm dying. My body, my arms, my legs, they hurt. Chanty's voice trembled, weak. Vasper said nothing. Instead, he cupped his hands in the water and brought it to her lips. Once, twice, 3 times. She drank. Her hands, trembling, clung to his. When she had enough, she gave a weak signal. Enough. Vasper nodded. Without hesitation, he lifted her again, carrying her deeper into the tree's shade. Tearing a strip from his already ruined pants, he gently wiped the dirt and sweat from her face. And despite the grime, the exhaustion, the battle scars, her beauty remained untouched. Even in this moment, she was radiant. Her eyes fluttered shut. And then, Vasper leaned in, pressed his lips to hers. A whisper, barely audible, against her mouth. "I'm sorry." Chanty's eyes opened. She did not move. She did not stop him. But her voice, steady, resolute. "Vasper, I want this fight to end today. I will not return until I avenge Jake." A single tear slid down her cheek. Her gaze was not on Vasper. It was on her hand. Her fingers, tightly gripping Jake's wedding ring. Vasper stared at her. His heart ached. But he understood. He said nothing, did nothing. He let her grieve. And yet, even in death, even as a memory, Jake's presence still stood between them. Jealousy burned in Vasper's chest. But he swallowed it down. Instead, he reached for her hand. Held it. His voice, low. "When Alexander returns, do not give him a chance to escape. Kill him before he disappears again." Chanty didn't respond. She only followed Vasper's gaze. To the battlefield. To the wounded guardians. To the agony still gripping them. Their bodies shaking from the venom of the crystal sword. In the distance, David carried Marco and Louis toward the shade, their wounds still bleeding into the sand. Jacob followed, carrying Gabriel. Justin walked behind them, his face grim, his body covered in dust, sweat, and blood. All of them. Their hair, their skin, stained with war. Their clothes were torn. Their pants, shredded. Their muscles, exposed. And yet, their beauty remained. Even battered, bruised, and covered in dust, they still carried that magnetic allure. That undeniable presence. But despite their power, despite their might, none of them had left a wound on Alexander Mondragon. David arrived first, carefully laying Marco and Louis by the pond's edge. The two warriors gasped. Desperate, parched. They drank. David, too, cupped his hands in the water, drinking deep. Jacob and Justin arrived next. Equally exhausted. Equally thirsty. They drank without a word. And then, David turned. His eyes landing on Chanty. She was still. Her eyes closed. Her body weak. And in Vasper's arms, she rested, wrapped in his protective embrace. David stepped closer. "Chanty, are you okay?" No response. She didn't even open her eyes. Vasper tightened his hold on her. His voice, firm. "We need to go back to the tent. She needs food. She needs to regain her strength." David nodded. Without hesitation, Vasper lifted Chanty into his arms. The others. Jacob. Justin. Gabriel. Louis. Marco. They placed their hands on his shoulders. A silent unity. A silent understanding. Chanty didn't even stir. She didn't bother to open her eyes. They moved as one. A procession of warriors. Returning to camp. And when they arrived, gasps. Whispers. Shock. All eyes turned to them. And then, to Chanty, carried in Vasper's arms. But no gaze burned hotter than Lauren's. Her eyes. Sharp. Intense. Piercing. Jake's cousin. She stared at Vasper. At Chanty in his arms. At the silent closeness between them. But Vasper didn't even glance her way. And the guardians didn't stop. Instead, they ordered Mara to prepare food for Chanty. Vasper carried her inside, straight to a private room. And as he settled her down, he heard it. Lauren's voice. speaking, looking for Jake. Vasper listened, silently, as he tended to Chanty. Then, silence. The noise outside vanished. A soft knock. Mara entered, carrying a basin of warm water. Vasper turned. "I'll do it," he said. Mara hesitated, then nodded. She placed the basin down and left, closing the door behind her. Vasper sat beside Chanty. "You can't bathe," he murmured. "I'll just wipe you down." Chanty did not respond, but tears had already begun to fall. Silently, her mind was with Jake. Vasper said nothing. He simply reached forward and unzipped her suit. Chanty let him. Didn't resist. Didn't react. She just cried. And Vasper let her. He took the cloth and gently wiped her face, her neck, her chest. His touch, soft, careful, full of devotion. When he was done, he sat back. "Change," he said quietly. Slowly, Chanty sat up. But instead of dressing, she walked to the bathroom. Vasper watched her go, understanding. Her body burned with fever. A simple wipe wouldn't be enough. So he waited, seated on the edge of the bed. He waited. Minutes passed. Then, Mara returned, carrying a tray of food. And as she stepped out, Chanty stepped in, a towel wrapped around her, her hair dripping wet. Vasper stood immediately. Their eyes met, but Chanty said nothing. Her lips, swollen from Alexander's bite. Her eyes, red from crying. And then, she began to change. Right in front of him. Vasper turned away. Not out of disinterest, but out of respect. Because even now, even with his desire burning inside him, it wasn't the time. When she was dressed, he guided her to the table. Eat. She did. But she was silent. Too silent. The air between them, heavy, oppressive, almost deafening. And Vasper watched her, her trembling hands, her blank stare, her barely parted lips, like she was about to cry all over again. And it hurt. It hurt him, because she was mourning Jake. And even in death, even as dust, Jake still stood between them. Vasper clenched his fists. Jealousy, pain. But he swallowed it down. He let her grieve. And then, a knock. David entered. And in his arms, a uniform, a pair of combat boots, and nothing else. Jake's. That was all that remained of him. Chanty froze. Her breath hitched. Her chest heaved. And then, she broke. A wail of agony tore from her lips. Loud, raw, uncontrollable. She grabbed the uniform, clutched it to her chest, as if she could hold him again. But she couldn't, because there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit, no funeral to attend. Jake had vanished, turned to dust, lost forever. A storm of grief, a broken woman. She clutched the fabric as if it were Jake himself. And then, a sound, raw, piercing, uncontainable. Her sobs filled the tent, and everyone froze. The weight of her sorrow wrapped around them, suffocating. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Instead, they listened. They understood. They let her grieve. Her husband was dead. And this was her mourning. Vasper disappeared. Gone. Vanished before David's eyes. David understood. He saw what burned inside Vasper. Jealousy. Pain. A war within himself. So David did nothing. He simply watched. Watched Chanty on the floor, holding on to the last remnants of Jake. And he waited. Waited for her sobs to slow. Several minutes passed. Waited for her body to still. And when silence finally came, so did Vasper. He was changed. Fresh clothes. Damp hair. The scent of soap clinging to his skin. He had bathed. But his eyes, they never left Chanty. And in the quiet, they spoke volumes. Chanty said nothing. She folded Jake's clothes with trembling hands, placed them inside her luggage, and sealed them away. Not a word was spoken. And then, Vasper moved. A single step forward. No hesitation. No doubt. He wrapped his arms around her. She let herself be held. David felt it. Felt the shift. He was an outsider now. So he stood. And left. Saying nothing. The tent was heavy with sorrow. But inside the private room, Chanty clung to Vasper. Her sobs muffled against his chest. And Vasper held her tighter. But his embrace was not just one of comfort. It was one of possession. Because deep down, beneath his sympathy, beneath his silent respect, he was glad. Glad that Jake was gone. Glad that Chanty was finally his. No more rival. No more competition. Only him. Still, he played his role well. He stroked her hair, whispered gentle reassurances. And when he kissed her, it was soft, careful, mindful of her swollen lips, the ones Alexander Mondragon had bitten. He brushed away her damp strands. And Chanty just stared. Not at his face, but at his chest. At the way his muscles stretched beneath his black shirt. She was still crying silently. Still wiping away tears. And Vasper never looked away. Then, a whisper. I love you. Right against her ear. But Chanty did not respond. Did not react. Only silence. So Vasper tilted her chin up. Forced her to meet his eyes. And she saw it. The dampness of his hair. The warmth of his smile. I bathed quickly, he murmured. So I could hold you. As if reading her thoughts. But Chanty's mind was already elsewhere. Alexander. The desert. Her vengeance. I want to go back, she said. Vasper stilled. Take me to Alexander. Silence stretched between them. Then, a nod. Change into your combat suit. Chanty obeyed. She reached for her uniform. The same one she had stripped off. And Vasper helped her suit. But every movement, every touch, was a test of his restraint. Her bare skin, her body in front of him, a temptation, a battle against his own desires. And Chanty noticed. She felt the way his breath hitched, the way his muscles tensed. But she said nothing, because right now, revenge was more important. When she was fully dressed, Vasper grabbed her, pulled her close, and held her tight. I miss you. The words were whispered. Low. Deep. Chanty did not move. Did not resist. And when he kissed her, it was different. More than comfort. More than longing. It was devotion. Tender. But burning. And when he pulled away, I love you so much. A whispered confession against her ear. But before she could respond, a voice. Vasper. David. We're going with you. Vasper turned to Chanty. He studied her. From head to toe. Ready. Except. Her hair. Still wet. Dry your hair first, he ordered. Vasper. You know how much sand sticks to wet hair. A sigh. A quiet understanding. Vasper grabbed a towel and began drying her hair himself. Firm. Gentle. Unwavering. And Chanty let him. She said nothing. Did nothing. Until finally, her hair was dry. But not fully dried. Just in time for Mara to step inside. She took their dishes and left. Then the guardians entered. David, Louis, Marco, Gabriel. They were ready, clean, healed, armored. Are their wounds healed? Chanty asked. Marco smiled. Don't worry, Chanty. We're fine. But it was Jacob. His stare. His cold, unreadable gaze. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Vasper. A silent challenge. A silent rage. And Vasper noticed. But he ignored it. There was no time for this. Not now. David approached first. Then he stopped. His gaze fell on Chanty's hair. Chanty, you should tie your hair. The desert will be brutal. Embarrassment. Chanty's eyes darted around, searching. For a rubber band. For anything. But before she could find one, Vasper was already holding it. And then his hands were in her hair, pulling it up, securing it. The guardians watched. Jacob's expression darkened. But Chanty simply whispered, "Thank you." And Vasper did not answer. He just pulled her into his arms, held her, and prepared to teleport them back to the desert. To Alexander Mondragon.